Welcome to The Sleepy Christian, where we reflect on God's power and presence in a calm, soothing way. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most powerful moments in the Bible, when God answered Elijah with fire on Mount Carmel. But this isn't just a story about fire, it's a story about faith, doubt, renewal, and the gentle awakening of a sleepy soul. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below, and let's see how far God's word is reaching tonight. Now let's travel back to ancient Israel. Israel was once a nation built on the foundation of God's covenant. From the days of Abraham to Moses leading the people out of Egypt and Joshua entering the promised land, Israel had been chosen and set apart. But now, generations later, something had changed. The people no longer remembered. The fire of devotion that once burned in their hearts had dimmed into flickering embers. What had once been a living, breathing relationship with the one true God had become a distant memory, buried under layers of distraction, compromise, and spiritual fatigue. The king of Israel at the time was Ahab, a man who did more evil in the sight of the Lord than all the kings before him. But even more dangerous than his own corruption was the influence of his wife, Jezebel. She wasn't just a foreign queen, she was a determined promoter of false religion, bringing in hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah. Altars to the God of Israel were torn down, and new ones, dedicated to lifeless idols, were raised in their place. The worship of the true God was no longer honored, it was outlawed. The prophets of the Lord were hunted, silenced, or forced into hiding. And yet the people didn't resist. They didn't cry out. They didn't remember the God who had once split the Red Sea for their ancestors. They simply accepted it. They drifted. They slept. There was no great rebellion, no declaration of war against God. Just a slow fade, a growing numbness, a spiritual drowsiness that made them forget who they were, and more importantly, whose they were. They still went through the motions. Perhaps some still prayed, perhaps some still told the old stories. But the heartbeat of faith was gone. It was like they were alive, but not awake, breathing, but not truly living. They had become a nation, asleep at the soul. And isn't that a picture of many believers today? It doesn't always happen through dramatic sin or open rebellion. Sometimes we just fall asleep. One compromise at a time, one unanswered prayer at a time, one disappointment, one distraction, one delay. We say we believe, but our passion is gone. We say God is our provider, yet we panic when money runs out. We say He is our shepherd, yet we live like lost sheep. We say He is our first love, but He has become our last resort. Spiritual sleep is subtle. It's not like turning off a light. It's more like twilight, a slow dimming of the soul, until you don't even notice how dark it's become. That's what happened to Israel. They didn't realize how far they had drifted from the God who brought them out of slavery, who gave them manna from heaven, who made water flow from rocks and walls fall with shouts. They forgot that they were His people, chosen not for comfort, but for covenant. They had been called to reflect His light to the world, but now that light was nearly out. And in this silence, in this slumber, God was not absent. He was watching, waiting, and preparing a prophet. Elijah would not come with empty words. He would come with the fire of heaven. But before the fire could fall, the people had to see just how asleep they had become. And perhaps, so do we. In a land shrouded in silence, where truth had been buried under layers of falsehood and fear, there arose one man who refused to sleep. Elijah. His name alone was a declaration, "My God is Yahweh." And while others bowed their heads to Baal and offered sacrifices to lifeless idols, Elijah stood tall with a fire in his spirit that no drought, no king, and no queen could extinguish. He didn't look like a warrior. He didn't have soldiers or chariots or royal garments. He was a man of the wilderness, clothed in rough garments of hair and leather. He didn't carry a sword. Only the word of the living God. But in the courts of heaven, Elijah was a giant. In a time when nearly every voice had gone quiet, he dared to speak. When prophets were being hunted, he dared to remain visible. When others cowered in caves or compromised their faith to survive, he stood in the open, proclaiming judgment in the very face of power. He walked into the throne room of Ahab, the most powerful man in Israel, and said the unthinkable. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. It was a sentence of drought, a divine shutdown of the land's most basic need, water. In an agricultural society, rain meant survival. No rain meant famine, economic collapse, death. But this wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. Baal, the so-called god of storms and fertility, was being directly challenged. Elijah's very words said, "Let's see who really controls the heavens." Then Elijah disappeared. He vanished into the wilderness at God's command, hidden by divine providence. While the drought worsened, while Jezebel's fury grew, while the people watched their crops wither and their rivers shrink, Elijah remained with God, fed by ravens near a brook, then later by a poor widow whose own miracle of provision became a testimony in itself. For 3 long years, Elijah lived in obedience, listening, waiting, preparing. He was a man alone, yet never lonely, because in the stillness, God spoke. In the isolation, God refined him. When everyone else was running from the truth, Elijah was being anchored in it. He wasn't just a man with a message, he was becoming the message. God wasn't just using Elijah to confront a nation, he was shaping Elijah to carry the weight of fire. While Israel slept, Elijah stayed awake, not just in body, but in spirit, awake to God's voice, awake to God's pain, awake to the covenant that had been so terribly broken. He carried within him the ache of heaven, a burden not just for judgment, but for revival. He wasn't angry for the sake of anger. He was grieved for the sake of God's glory. And more than anything, he longed to see Israel come back, to see the hearts of the people turn once again toward the one who had carried them through deserts and battles and impossible odds. But standing for truth always comes at a cost. Elijah knew he was risking his life. He knew Jezebel's prophets were everywhere, that he was being hunted like prey. He knew that standing alone meant being misunderstood, even hated. Yet he didn't flinch, because in Elijah's heart, fear had been replaced with fire. Not the fire of anger or pride, but the fire of conviction, the fire of purpose, the fire that comes from walking so closely with God that everything else fades into the background. Sometimes it only takes one person, one voice, one soul willing to stay awake in a world that's asleep. Elijah wasn't powerful in the way kings are powerful, but he had something far greater. He had intimacy with God. He had truth. He had the courage to live it. And that's what made him dangerous to the darkness. In every generation, there comes a moment when God looks for someone, just one, who will not bend, will not bow, and will not break. Someone who will carry the torch even when the wind howls and the night grows cold. Elijah was that man, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing. In the midst of spiritual drought, Elijah became a living stream. In the silence, he became a voice crying out. And as the world slumbered under the weight of deception, he prepared for the moment when God would speak through him, not with a whisper, but with fire. The sun rose over Mount Carmel, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. It was an ancient, sacred place, a high place once known for encounters with God, now chosen again for a divine confrontation. On that day, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Israel had gathered, summoned by King Ahab and stirred by rumors of a prophet's challenge. Thousands came, not out of faith, but out of curiosity, fear, and spectacle. They had heard of Elijah's return. They had heard of the drought he had predicted and how it had come true. Now they came to see what would happen next. Elijah stood alone on the mountain, facing not only a crowd of onlookers, but 450 prophets of Baal and another 400 prophets of Asherah, all fed and protected by Queen Jezebel. These weren't mere religious men, they were the spiritual elite of a false system that had seduced a nation. Dressed in ornate robes, covered in symbols and trained in rituals, they represented everything that had taken the people away from the one true God. They were confident, they were numerous, and they were completely wrong. But Elijah was not intimidated. He didn't come to debate, he came to draw a line. As he stepped forward, his voice rang out, not just over the crowd, but into their hearts. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him. Silence. Not a single voice answered. The people didn't shout back in defiance. They didn't cry out in agreement. They just stood there, caught in the fog of spiritual confusion. Their hearts had been torn in two for so long that they didn't even know what truth felt like anymore. They had become experts in compromise, fluent in religious convenience, and now that a real choice stood before them, they were paralyzed. And that was exactly the point. Elijah wasn't merely setting up a showdown, he was exposing the sickness of a divided heart. The Hebrew word he used, waver, means to limp or to dance between two positions. It's the image of someone trying to serve two masters, never fully committed to either. And isn't that the condition of many hearts today? Not fully rejecting God, but not fully surrendered either. Living somewhere in the in-between, just spiritual enough to feel good, but too compromised to bear fruit. Elijah knew that words alone wouldn't awaken the people. They needed something undeniable, so he laid down the challenge. 2 altars would be built, one for Baal, one for the Lord. 2 bulls would be prepared, but no fire would be lit. Instead, the prophets of Baal would call on their God, and Elijah would call on his. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The people agreed. This they could understand. A contest, a test, a moment of clarity. The prophets of Baal went first. From morning until noon, they danced and shouted. They leapt around the altar they had made, calling on Baal to answer. They sang songs. They performed rituals. As the hours passed, their desperation grew. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, letting blood flow in hopes it would draw their god's attention. Their chants turned to screams. Their dances turned to frenzied chaos. But the heavens were silent. No fire, no voice, no movement, nothing. Elijah watched it all, unmoved. At one point he mocked them, not out of cruelty, but to reveal the absurdity of their belief. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Still, there was no answer, because idols never answer. They are deaf. They are dead. They are powerless to save, no matter how passionately we worship them. Whether carved from stone or formed in the heart, idols are always silent in the end. As the sun reached its peak and the prophets of Baal collapsed from exhaustion, Elijah stepped forward. One man, one voice, no magic, no madness, just faith. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord with 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, a symbolic act that reminded the people who they truly were. He dug a trench around it. He arranged the wood, cut the bull, and laid it on the altar. Then, to make the impossible even more impossible, he did something shocking. He poured water over the sacrifice. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, until the meat, the wood, and even the trench were soaked. It was drenched. Humanly speaking, it couldn't be burned. And that was the point. Elijah wanted everyone watching to know, if fire fell, it wouldn't be a trick. It wouldn't be manipulation. It wouldn't be human effort. It would be God and only God. At that moment, he didn't need volume or drama. He simply prayed, quietly, humbly. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't a performance. It was a plea from a heart that longed to see a sleeping nation wake up. And in that stillness, something stirred in heaven. Because when one man stands in faith, heaven takes notice. The people stood in silence again, not because they were unsure, but because they were waiting for something divine. Their eyes were fixed on the altar, their breath caught in their throats. They didn't know it yet, but they were standing on the edge of a miracle, and God was about to answer. The prophets of Baal had given everything they had. From sunrise to late afternoon, they poured out their energy, their voices, even their own blood. What began as confident worship quickly devolved into desperation. They cried out to a God they had never truly heard, danced for an answer that never came, and bled for a hope that was never real. And still, the heavens remained shut. There is a terrible silence that descends when everything you believed in fails you. That's what settled over Mount Carmel that day. The crowd, which had once leaned in with curiosity, was now growing restless. The people who had come for a spectacle were beginning to see something far more sobering: the emptiness of their devotion. Baal was supposed to be the god of storms, fertility, and fire. He was believed to ride the clouds and hurl lightning bolts to bring life from the heavens. But when the moment came to show his power, not even a spark, no wind, no voice, no fire, just silence. That silence said more than 1,000 words. It revealed the hollowness behind the rituals. It exposed the fraud. Because if Baal couldn't answer now, at the peak of national worship, with his prophets crying out in agony, with a sacrifice laid out in his honor, then he would never answer. And deep down, the people knew it. They had been deceived, not just by Jezebel and her priests, but by their own desires. They wanted a God who would give them what they wanted without requiring repentance. A God of comfort, not covenant. A God who demanded offerings but made no demands on their hearts. Baal was the perfect idol for a nation that wanted religion without righteousness. But idols always fail in the end. They lure us in with promises of control. Worship Baal and you'll get rain. Follow Baal and your crops will grow. But when life truly falls apart, when the land is dry and the soul is thirsting, they offer nothing but silence. False gods can't speak. False gods can't act. False gods can't save. And what made the moment on Mount Carmel so profound wasn't just Baal's failure. It was the sheer futility of human effort in the face of divine absence. These prophets did everything. They shouted at the top of their lungs. They danced until their legs gave out. They cut themselves, offering their own blood as if that could stir something in the heavens. It was religion at its most extreme, and yet it accomplished nothing. This is the tragedy of misplaced worship. It wears us out. It exhausts the body. It confuses the mind. It wounds the spirit. People give their entire lives chasing gods that cannot answer, whether it's success, fame, power, romance, or the approval of others. They burn themselves out, trying to please something that doesn't love them, trying to earn something that will never fill the void in their heart. They look to the world's altars and find only dust. What happened on Mount Carmel wasn't just a lesson in idolatry. It was a mirror held up to every heart that has ever tried to earn what can only be received by grace. The prophets of Baal were sincere. They were passionate. They were utterly committed. And they were completely wrong. That's a sobering truth. Passion does not equal truth. Just because we feel something deeply doesn't make it divine. Emotion doesn't create reality. It only reveals what we believe. And if what we believe is false, then even our strongest devotion leads us into emptiness. The people of Israel were watching this unfold in real time. They saw the frenzy, they saw the failure, and for the first time in a long time, they began to feel the weight of their choices. The nation had traded the living God for a silent one, and now they stood in the tension of that silence. But there's another silence in this story. One that doesn't come from false gods, but from the true one. For hours, God remained quiet. Elijah didn't interrupt. He didn't call down fire early. He let the failure of Baal run its full course. Why? Because sometimes God waits for the noise to die down before he speaks. Sometimes he lets the idols fail so completely that there can be no doubt who is truly in control. Sometimes the silence is mercy. It gives us space to see what we've been trusting in. It gives us time to feel the ache of absence. And only when we are truly empty will we be ready to receive the fullness of His presence. Mount Carmel became a place of reckoning that day, not just for the prophets of Baal, but for every soul watching. The people didn't cry out to Elijah. They didn't repent yet. They just stood in stunned silence. Because for the first time in a long time, they were beginning to wake up. Not with shouting, not with dancing, but with stillness. They were beginning to realize that the God they had served for years had nothing to say to them. That all their offerings, all their compromises, all their spiritual sleepwalking had led them to a dead end. And in that sacred pause, in that dry and dusty silence, something began to stir. Not in the sky, not in the altar, but in the heart. The moment before God moves is often the quietest of all. The ground goes still, the wind stops blowing, the noise of human striving fades into the background, and the soul leans forward, waiting, hoping, ready, because when heaven answers, it will be with a voice no one can deny, and all the silence of this chapter will only make that answer more powerful. As the shadows lengthened over Mount Carmel and the frenzied cries of the prophets of Baal faded into exhausted silence, Elijah stepped forward. The entire nation had been watching, waiting, caught between doubt and anticipation. The full spectacle was over. Now, the stage belonged to a single man, not a king, not a performer, just a prophet, and not even one who looked impressive by worldly standards. Elijah didn't shout. He didn't whip the crowd into a frenzy. He didn't conjure up elaborate rituals. He simply walked with calm authority, the kind that only comes from a deep, hidden life with God. His every movement was deliberate. Each gesture carried meaning. With no fear in his eyes, he knelt beside the ruined altar of the Lord, a place that had once been sacred but was now broken and forgotten. He began to rebuild it. Stone by stone, he placed 12 uncut stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, though the nation itself had long since divided into north and south. It was an act not just of construction, but of remembrance. Elijah was reminding the people of who they were. They were not Baal's children. They were not a people of compromise. They were a covenant people. They had a history with the God of heaven, a history soaked in miracles, deliverance, and divine love. As the altar took shape, the crowd grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with awe. Something sacred was unfolding. Elijah laid the wood in order, cut the sacrifice, and arranged it on the altar. Then he did something that made everyone gasp. He called for water. In the middle of a devastating drought, where every drop of water was precious, Elijah asked for 4 large jars of water to be poured over the offering and the wood. And not just once, 3 times, 12 jars in total. Enough to drench the altar, soak the wood, and fill the trench he had dug around it. The water flowed down the rocks and pooled at the base. It was utterly irrational. Fire could never burn wet wood, let alone consume a soaked sacrifice. But that was the point. Elijah wanted there to be no confusion, no illusion, no possibility that anyone could say this was sleight of hand or trickery. If fire fell, it would be unmistakably divine. The sun was now lower in the sky, casting golden light across the mountaintop. The people leaned in. They were ready, and Elijah, without pomp or theatrics, lifted his face to heaven and prayed. His prayer was short, simple, powerful. "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, not just invoking names, but calling upon the legacy of the covenant. This was not a new religion. This was the God of their fathers, the God who had walked with them through deserts and rivers, through slavery and freedom. Elijah continued, "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." There was no self-glorification in his voice, no ego, no manipulation. He was not asking for fire to validate himself, but to reveal God. This was not a test for the sake of drama. It was a cry for truth to be seen, for hearts to be turned back. "Answer me, Lord," he pleaded. "Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again." Not if you are God, not if you are listening, but because you are. Elijah prayed with certainty, with deep intimacy. He wasn't hoping God might show up. He knew he would. Because Elijah had walked in obedience. He had waited in silence. He had trusted through the drought. And now he stood ready to receive. This kind of prayer doesn't come from theory. It doesn't come from someone who only knows about God. It comes from someone who knows God, someone who has lived in the quiet places with him, cried out in the lonely nights, heard his whisper in the dark. Elijah's prayer was not long, but it was full of fire, before the fire ever fell. And then, heaven responded, not with a whisper, not with a breeze, but with fire. Real fire, holy fire, consuming fire. It fell from the sky like lightning, blazing with the fury of 1,000 suns. It didn't just ignite the wood, it devoured it. It didn't just burn the sacrifice, it incinerated the stones. It licked up the water from the trench and left nothing behind but scorched earth. It was violent, glorious, immediate. The fire of God left no room for doubt. And in that instant, the people fell on their faces. The same people who had stood in silence now cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God." The drought hadn't awakened them, the famine hadn't broken them, the silence of Baal hadn't convinced them, but this moment, this fire, shook them awake. Their hearts, hardened by compromise and dulled by idolatry, were pierced by the presence of the living God. And it all began with a simple prayer. Elijah didn't manipulate the moment. He didn't manufacture results. He just obeyed. And when he prayed, he didn't ask for fame or power or even revenge. He asked for revelation, that the people would see God clearly and turn back. This is the power of humble faith. When the world is loud and confused, when false answers dance and shout and bleed for attention, God waits for someone who will come to him in stillness and say, "Let them know you are God." That's the kind of prayer that heaven answers, not always with fire from the sky, but always with presence, always with power, always in perfect timing. And maybe, just maybe, that's the prayer someone needs to whisper tonight, not to impress, not to perform, but to return. The fire fell. In one blinding, heart-stopping moment, heaven opened and answered with unmistakable force. The sacrifice was consumed, the stones shattered, the water in the trench evaporated in an instant. What should have been impossible happened in front of thousands of eyes. It was not symbolic, it was not poetic, it was real, a physical, supernatural act that defied every law of nature and crushed every doubt lingering in the minds of the people. The fire of God was not gentle. It did not politely nudge the people back to faith. It roared, it devoured, it shook the mountain and seared the conscience of a nation. It was not a soft candle's flicker, but a furnace of divine judgment and mercy all at once. This was not just about proving that Yahweh was God. It was about reclaiming hearts that had been stolen. The fire was God's signature, his undeniable proof that he had not abandoned his people, even though they had abandoned him. And in that fire, God said what words could not. He declared his holiness, his power, his presence, and most of all, his patience. Because God could have sent fire long before this. He could have rained judgment when the altars were first torn down. He could have acted when the first cries to Baal went up. But he waited, not because he was absent, but because he was merciful. He gave them time to repent, time to reflect, time to see the futility of their idols. And then, at the appointed hour, when every voice of Baal had fallen silent and all hope in false gods had dried up, then he answered, and he answered not with words, but with fire. It was a fire that burned through more than just an altar. It burned through the fog of confusion, through the lies the people had believed, through the numbness of their hearts. It brought light to a nation that had been stumbling in spiritual darkness for too long. It cut through the noise and the ritual and got straight to the soul. The people didn't need to be told what had happened. They didn't need a sermon or an interpretation. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. they fell on their faces, not because someone told them to, not because they were manipulated or coerced, but because when true power appears, there is no room for pride, no space for standing, only surrender. They cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" It wasn't just a chant, it was a confession, a release, a cry of recognition. After years of spiritual amnesia, the people remembered, their hearts stirred, their knees hit the ground, and for the first time in a long time, they saw clearly. All at once, they understood what Elijah had known all along, that their lives were not their own, that their worship had been misplaced, that their land, their hearts, their breath, everything belonged to the God who answers by fire. And in that confession, the fire did its deepest work, not just on the altar, but inside them. Because fire is never just destructive in the hands of God, it is also refining. It purifies, it awakens, it heals. The same fire that consumes the lie also rekindles the truth. And on that mountain, hearts were reignited. But there's more. That moment, so dramatic, so divine, wasn't meant to be the end. It was the beginning, because God never sends fire just for show. He sends it for transformation. He wasn't just proving a point, he was reclaiming a people. The miracle wasn't just in what was burned, but in what was born, a turning of the heart. God had always wanted more than obedience. He wanted intimacy. He wanted Israel back, not just in name, but in love. And that is what the fire accomplished. It stripped away the veil, it shattered the illusion, and it left no doubt about who was worthy of worship. Yet here's the uncomfortable truth. The fire of God demands a response. It cannot be ignored. Once you see it, once you know, you are no longer in the land of excuses. The people on Mount Carmel could no longer pretend Baal was a valid option. They had seen the difference. They had heard nothing from Baal and everything from God. That's what true encounters do. They leave you changed, marked, unable to go back. And that's why many people today still resist the fire. Not because it's not real, but because it is. Because it changes you. Because it exposes the idols we've built with our own hands, even if we never called them Baal. It shows us that our comforts, our compromises, our silent little gods, whether they are careers, relationships, ambitions, or pride, cannot speak, cannot save, cannot love us back. And if we dare to stand before God like Elijah did, daring to believe that He will answer when we call, we must also be prepared for everything in us that is false to be burned away. Because God's fire always reveals. God's fire always divides. God's fire always purifies. The fire was a gift, a terrifying, beautiful gift. It came not to destroy the people, but to bring them back, to remind them of who God is and who they were meant to be. The people didn't just watch a miracle, they participated in it. Their hearts, once numb, were now soft again. Their knees, once proud, were now bent in reverence. And in the echo of their cry, "The Lord, He is God," we hear the sound of revival, a nation waking up, a soul turning home, a God still faithful even when His people had forgotten Him. That is the power of fire. That is the mercy of God. The people had fallen to their knees. Their lips had confessed what their hearts had long forgotten. The Lord, He is God. The fire from heaven had broken through the crust of indifference and shattered the illusion of Baal. The moment was raw, undeniable, electric. Something ancient had stirred inside the people of Israel. A memory, a longing, a truth that had always been there, buried under layers of compromise. They had seen fire fall. But what came next was even more important, because God doesn't send fire to entertain, He sends it to transform, and transformation demands action. After the miracle, after the awe, came the confrontation. Elijah turned to the people, newly awakened, freshly aware, and told them to seize the prophets of Baal, all 450 of them, and this time, no one hesitated. The same crowd that had once wavered in silence now surged forward with a new kind of clarity. The false prophets were taken to the Kishon Valley, and there they were executed. This moment is difficult, it's heavy. It's not the part of the story that gets told in children's Bibles or inspirational messages, but it's a vital part of what it means to truly turn back to God. Because spiritual revival is not just about feeling close to God. It's about cleansing the soul from the things that pulled you away in the first place. The execution of the prophets of Baal was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of purification. Israel had been infected by lies, poisoned by deception, and enslaved by systems that led them away from their Creator. These prophets weren't merely misguided men, they were agents of destruction. Their influence had led a nation into darkness, and now the darkness had to be removed. Not tolerated, not debated, removed. It was a visual symbol of what must happen in every true return to God. There comes a moment, after the fire, after the tears, after the revelation, when you must confront the idols in your own heart. Not with compromise, not with delay, but with the courage to say, this has no place in my life anymore. You cannot awaken to God and continue entertaining the things that lulled you to sleep. You cannot receive the fire and still protect the altars of Baal in your private life. This is the part of revival that few are willing to face. We want the passion without the pain, the light without the cleansing. But God's fire doesn't just burn on the mountain, it burns inside us. And it calls us to make hard decisions, to sever ties, to walk away from toxic relationships, hidden sins, comfortable compromises, and familiar deceptions, to remove the very things we once protected. The people of Israel did it that day. They followed Elijah down the mountain. They watched the prophets of Baal fall. And in that valley, something powerful happened. The grip of deception was broken, not just on a national level, but deep inside the hearts of individuals. The people who had once sacrificed their children to idols now saw clearly. The fog had lifted, and with it came the realization that Baal had never loved them, never answered them, never existed at all. And the space that lie once occupied, it was now empty, empty and ready for something better, something true. And that's where many people today find themselves after a spiritual awakening, after the fire, after the confession. You look around and you realize, I can't go back. But then comes the question, what now? And the answer, as always, begins with surrender. Elijah knew what was next. The land was still dry, the skies still barren. The drought wasn't over yet. The fire had fallen, but the rain had not come. Why? Because God wasn't just restoring belief, He was restoring relationship. The people had seen His power, yes, but now they needed to walk with Him again. Not just for one dramatic moment, but day by day, choice by choice. That is the true mark of a heart awakened. Not just reacting to the miraculous, but responding with obedience. Not just falling on your face in awe, but standing up and living differently. This chapter of the story is a quiet one compared to the fire. But it is just as vital. It reminds us that revival is not a flash of light. It's a path forward, a change of direction, a commitment to live under the authority of the God who answered with fire. Israel had that chance now. They had seen what was false fall to the ground. They had seen the truth descend from heaven. And now they stood on the threshold of something new. The fire had awakened them. The truth had pierced them. And the idols had been removed. But would they continue? Would they walk with the God who had never stopped loving them? Would they build new altars, not just of stone, but of obedience, faith, and daily surrender? The next chapter would begin with a cloud, but this one ended with a people, finally awake. The fire had fallen. The people had bowed. The false prophets had been removed. But even after such a powerful display of God's presence, Elijah knew that something deeper still needed to happen. A nation can be awestruck in a moment and yet still forget in a week. Spectacle can stir the heart, but only relationship sustains it. That's why Elijah didn't simply celebrate and leave. He climbed higher. Up the slopes of Mount Carmel beyond the crowds, away from the noise, Elijah ascended alone. And there, with nothing but sky above and earth below, he fell on his face before God. The fire had proven who God was, but now Elijah longed for something else, for the rain to return. For 3.5 years, not a drop, had fallen on Israel. The skies had been closed, the earth cracked, the crops shriveled. The drought was not merely environmental, it was spiritual. It represented the judgment of a people who had turned away from the giver of life. And even though the people had now seen God's power, the land still groaned under the weight of dryness. But Elijah knew the pattern of God's mercy. He knew that fire was never the end of the story. Fire awakens, but rain restores. So he prayed. And this prayer was different from the one he had spoken in front of the people. That prayer had been bold, public, filled with authority and certainty. This prayer was quiet, humble, hidden. Elijah knelt with his head between his knees, an ancient posture of deep travail. It was as if he was birthing something in the spirit, contending not for fire this time, but for life. 7 times he sent his servant to go and look toward the sea. Each time the answer came back the same: nothing, no wind, no clouds, no shift in the sky. But Elijah didn't stop. This is what separates emotional moments from enduring faith. Fire falls quickly. Rain often takes time. God can speak in a flash, but his blessings sometimes flow in stages. Elijah's perseverance in prayer revealed something essential. He wasn't just chasing miracles. He was carrying the burden of his people. He knew they needed more than a dramatic moment. They needed water, nourishment, renewal. They needed rain. So he stayed on the mountain, face to the ground, praying until the breakthrough came. On the 7th time, the servant returned with the faintest sign, just a small cloud rising from the sea, no bigger than a man's hand. It was barely noticeable, easy to dismiss, but Elijah rose immediately. He knew what that cloud meant, because faith doesn't wait for the sky to turn black. It sees the promise in the smallest sign. It believes before the storm breaks. Elijah told his servant to run to Ahab and say, "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." And sure enough, the sky began to shift. The wind picked up. The darkness gathered. And then it came, a heavy rain, the kind that drenches the earth, fills the rivers, and breaks the drought. It poured not just on the land, but on the hearts of the people. God was not just showing his power anymore. He was revealing his kindness, his forgiveness, his desire not only to awaken, but to restore. And yet, in all this, something remarkable happened. As the rain began to fall and Ahab fled toward his palace in Jezreel, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Elijah, and the prophet, an old man in a long robe, outran the king's chariot. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because revival is not a moment to be walked away from. It's something to carry forward, to guard, to shepherd. But Elijah was about to learn a new lesson. He had seen God in the fire. He had seen him in the rain. But the most transformative moment was still ahead. Because fire and rain may change a nation, but only the still, small voice can change a heart forever. After the triumph on Mount Carmel, Elijah expected a revival. He expected the king and queen to repent. He expected Jezebel to fall and Israel to turn fully back to God. But when word reached her of what had happened, her response was chilling. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." She wasn't shaken, she was enraged. And just like that, the prophet who had just stood before thousands, who had called down fire, who had prayed rain from the sky, ran. He fled into the wilderness, discouraged, afraid, and alone. This is the paradox of spiritual life. Sometimes our highest moments are followed by our lowest. Sometimes after the fire and the rain comes the silence. And in that silence, our doubts creep in. Elijah, now hiding under a broom tree, asked God to take his life. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take me now." But God didn't rebuke him. He sent an angel instead. The angel touched Elijah, gave him bread and water, and told him to rest. Twice this happened, and when Elijah had been strengthened, he traveled to Mount Horeb, the very mountain where Moses had once met God. There, in a cave, Elijah poured out his heart. "I've been very zealous for you. but I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. It wasn't just fear, it was despair. The fire hadn't fixed everything, the rain hadn't changed the world overnight. Elijah felt like it had all been for nothing, and so God invited him to stand on the mountain. Then came a mighty wind, but God was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, but God was not in the earthquake. Then came fire, but God was not in the fire. And then a still, small voice, a whisper. That's where God was. And that was the deepest lesson Elijah had to learn. God isn't only in the dramatic, He is in the gentle. He isn't always in the fire that falls or the rain that pours. Sometimes He speaks in a whisper that touches the soul. Because after the nation is awakened, the individual must be healed. God told Elijah that he wasn't alone, that there were still 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal, that his work was not in vain, that his life still had purpose. And so Elijah rose again, not in fire, not in fame, but in quiet faith. Because after the fire and the rain, we must all learn to hear the whisper. It is in the whisper that we are known. It is in the whisper that we are restored. It is in the whisper that we find the courage to keep going. Even now, long after the fire has fallen and the rain has come, the soul of the sleepy Christian still drifts in and out of wakefulness. For though the spectacle has passed, and though the mountaintop has burned with holy presence, many find themselves slowly returning to the habits of spiritual slumber. Why? Because spiritual sleep is not simply a lack of knowledge. It's not about ignorance or rebellion alone. It is, more often, a quiet erosion, a weariness of heart, a slow fading of light, a drowsy compromise that wraps around the soul like a soft blanket. The sleepy Christian doesn't deny God. They don't curse Him or walk away in rage. Instead, they gently drift. They still attend the gathering. They still sing the songs, but the fire that once lit their soul, it's gone cold. The words of Scripture, once alive and electric, now lie flat on the page. Prayer feels like an echo in a room that's slowly losing air. A heaviness rests over everything. Elijah's story speaks directly to this place because even he, the great prophet, the man of fire, fell into that spiritual sleep. Not the sleep of ignorance, but the sleep of exhaustion. After the victories, after the fire, after the rain, came the crushing weight of disappointment. He had expected a revival. He had expected Jezebel's power to be broken, for Ahab to repent, for the people to remain awakened. But that didn't happen. The queen hardened her heart. The king remained passive. The nation quickly slipped back into silence. Elijah ran, not just in fear, but in despair. And this is where many Christians live, not in rebellion, but in retreat. Not in hatred of God, but in a quiet hopelessness that says, I've tried, I've given everything, and still, it feels like nothing changed. The sleepy Christian once burned with conviction. They once believed they could make a difference, but now they're just tired of unanswered prayers, tired of pretending, tired of carrying a calling that feels too heavy and results that feel too small. That's when the sleep begins, not in the body, but in the soul. And yet God does not abandon the sleepy Christian. He doesn't scold or shame. He doesn't lecture or leave. Instead, He does what He did for Elijah under the broom tree. He comes close, He touches, He feeds, He gives rest, and then gently He speaks. God knows how to revive a weary heart, not with thunder, not with lightning, but with bread baked on coals and water in a jar, with rest for the journey and strength for the next step. Because God knows that even prophets get tired, even the faithful grow numb, even the strongest need to be held. To be a sleepy Christian is not to be forgotten. It is to be pursued, not in wrath, but in compassion. And the way back is not complicated. It begins with honesty. Elijah said to God, I've had enough. He admitted his fear, his frustration, his sense of failure, and in doing so, he opened the door for God to speak again. The sleepy Christian must do the same. Not put on a show, not pretend they're on fire when they're not, but bring their weariness to the Lord and say, here I am, I'm tired, I don't know what to do, I've lost the fire. Because here's the truth, the fire isn't gone forever. It's not lost in the past. It hasn't been extinguished by time or pain. It's simply hidden beneath the ash, waiting for breath, God's breath. And when he whispers again, when his still small voice cuts through the noise of disappointment and calls you by name, something begins to stir. Something fragile, something sacred, something real. Not the loud fire of Mount Carmel, not the thunder of falling rain, but the quiet, persistent flame of relationship, of presence, of trust. The sleepy Christian doesn't need more spectacle. They need God himself, and that's exactly what God offers. Himself, not just as the fire from heaven or the power that defeats false gods, but as the companion in the cave, the whisper in the silence, the hand that lifts when you've collapsed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the fire begins to burn again. This time, not in front of crowds, but deep within the heart. Not with dramatic noise, but with enduring warmth. Not with a shout, but with a whisper that says, "You are not alone, you are not done, and I am still with you." The sleepy Christian awakens not with noise, but with presence. Not with pressure, but with peace. And they rise, not always to confront kings or call down fire, but to walk with God again, day by day, quietly, faithfully, fully alive. There is a sacred moment that comes after the fire, after the rain, after the whisper. A moment where a new choice must be made. Not the choice of belief, for that has been settled. Not the choice of confession, for that has already been cried out. But the choice of direction, of devotion, of whether or not we will rise and live a different kind of life now that we know, truly know, that God is real, that he answers, and that he calls. Elijah had seen it all. He had stood before kings. He had called down fire. He had prayed for rain and watched the heavens break open. He had felt the sting of despair and the comfort of God's hand. And now, having been renewed in the stillness of the cave, he emerged not just as a prophet, but as a man remade. He did not return to Mount Carmel to relive the moment. He didn't chase more miracles. He simply obeyed the next command of God. And that's the true test of a soul awakened. Not how loudly we can worship in the fire, but how quietly we can walk in the will of God after the fire fades. Because the fire is a moment, but faithfulness is a lifestyle. And so Elijah was sent back, not to perform more signs and wonders, but to anoint others, to commission new leaders, to pass on the mantle. God told him to anoint Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu over Israel, and Elisha as his prophetic successor. It was a reminder that God's work was never about one man, that revival never ends with a single voice, that true awakening spreads not by staying in one place, but by planting seeds in many. When a Christian truly wakes up, they realize something profound. This was never just about me. The fire that fell wasn't just for Elijah, it was for a nation. The rain wasn't just to prove a point, it was to give life. The whisper wasn't just to comfort, it was to commission. And that is the final call of the awakened soul, to become a light for others. To rise from the ashes of burnout and despair and become a voice of truth in a world full of noise. To walk not in performance, but in quiet obedience. To speak with the authority of someone who has heard God, not just once, but daily in the stillness. When God restores us, he doesn't just heal us, he sends us. That's what happened to Elijah. The man who once begged to die under a broom tree was now carrying God's next generation forward. He mentored Elisha. He prepared the way for those who would continue what he began. Because God's plan is never a moment, it is a movement, and he uses awakened souls to carry it. And here is where the sleepy Christian becomes the burning Christian. The one who no longer drifts through life half awake, tossed by emotions and exhaustion. The one who no longer waits for fire to fall before they believe. The one who no longer needs a miracle to trust, but walks by the memory of who God has already shown himself to be. This person walks differently, talks differently, loves differently. They begin to build new altars, not made of stone, but made of time with God, of sacrificial love, of humility, of truth. They carry the fire in their chest, not a consuming flame, but a steady burn that lights the way for others. And they understand that waking up wasn't the destination, it was only the beginning, because now they are the light in the darkness for someone else still asleep. Now they are the still small voice in a friend's chaos. Now they are the ones praying for fire to fall on another soul's broken altar. This is the legacy of the awakened, not fame, not spectacle, but faithfulness. And maybe that's your invitation tonight. Maybe you've seen the fire once. Maybe you've heard the whisper, but you've been waiting for a sign, for strength, for something dramatic to happen again. But maybe, just maybe, God is saying, you have everything you need. It's time to rise. To rise and walk in what you already know. To rise and build what God is asking you to build. To rise and speak what He has already spoken. To rise and love the people He's placed in your life. To rise and carry the fire, not on a mountaintop, but in the quiet places of your everyday life. This is where revival becomes real, not just in the moment when heaven touches earth, but in the ordinary moments where awakened hearts become obedient hands. So if you've been asleep, wake up. If you've been silent, speak. If you've been waiting, go. Because the same God who answered Elijah with fire, who refreshed him with rain, and who restored him with a whisper, is the same God who now calls you, and He is not finished yet.